Hello and welcome to the St. Charles County Police Department's first Lunch and Learn live event. I'm Sandy Miller with Fox 2 News, and I'm joined today by the St. Charles County Police Chief, Frisz, and the St. Charles County Prosecuting Attorney, Mr. Tim Lohmar. We're discussing a very difficult issue today that has long-lasting and devastating effects on the young children in our community and their families. We're talking about child abuse. And I don't know if you're aware, but April is actually National Child Abuse Prevention Month. So this is a perfect time for us to come together as a community to raise awareness about the perils of child abuse and neglect, and also recommit to the resources that are aimed at protecting children and families in our area. Well, today we have a very insightful discussion regarding the efforts of the St. Charles County law enforcement to protect children, to combat child abuse and neglect, and we want you to join us in that discussion. We'd like for you to share this event with family and friends, and also feel free to ask questions throughout the event by using your chat feature. Before we get started, I do want to say thank you to Fox 2 KTVI, as well as McDonald's Christian Foods, for donating the gift cards that we're going to be giving to our raffle winners today. And to find out if you're a winner, just check below. And I think you're all winners for joining us for this amazing discussion today. So we appreciate you being here. So right now I'd like to bring in Chief Frisz and Mr. Lohmar. And gentlemen, thank you for taking time for this very important event today, and thank you for including me in it. I really appreciate that. I think let's get started with you, Mr. Lohmar, to help our viewers understand what child abuse and neglect is as it's defined by the state of Missouri.
Sure. Well, Sandy, it's great to be with you. Thank you for taking your time out to host this special event, Chief. Good to be with you as well. So as you said, we're dealing with a sensitive topic here, and it's something that we don't like to talk about, but we have to. And it's conversations like this that hopefully get us to a place where we're better able to spot these crimes and solve them and hold offenders accountable. Under Missouri statute, it's fairly simple. Abuse is defined as any physical injury other than by accidental means caused by an adult who's responsible for the care, custody, or control of a child. We also lump in neglect with abuse because they share some similarities. Neglect, of course, is the failure to provide proper or necessary support, education, nutrition, or medical care. So that's kind of the generalities of what we deal with.
Talk about, if you will, and I know this is difficult, but the types of abuse and the types of neglect. Sure.
The most obvious type of abuse would be physical abuse. I think everybody's familiar with that. Neglect is one that, again, it's a close cousin of physical abuse. It's more of the caregivers, just a lack of attention or proper care to the child. Of course, we have sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, emotional abuse. That's a big one as well. Severe emotional abuse can be considered child abuse under the Missouri criminal code. And then lastly, I put abandonment as a type of abuse as well. And that falls more in line with neglect.
And Chief Frisz, I want to bring you in. I mean, I think that we all understand, and I said as we introduced the show, that child abuse and neglect can have long-lasting effects and devastating effects. Talk about the risk factors of child abuse and how it goes beyond just the immediate abuse and neglect.
Well, it does. And number one, we get these are always tragic when we get them. They're always tough to investigate. We're very fortunate here to have a robust cybercrime unit and dedicated detectives to investigate these. But when we see the risk factors, you're talking about the long-term mental impact it has on the young people, the kids, and whether it's physical abuse, mental abuse. The way we get reports are either through the anonymous tip line. We get some walk-ins, but when you're looking at the risk factors, it's pretty well rounded. It's going to evolve into trauma, mental health issues, lack of social support. We're just going to see a pretty wide variety of different risk factors that we run into daily.
I think it's one of those things too. It's one of those topics people are afraid to get involved. People are afraid to say anything, but it's so important to protect these children. How can we help protect these vulnerable children and parents, against child abuse and against this neglect?
Well, I think for anybody that suspects there may be some abuse going on or neglect, first thing is to contact the authorities either via the abuse and neglect hotline, which is scrolling at the bottom, or call 911 if it's that urgent, and or walk into the local police department and let them know so the investigation can start. But it's really see something, say something, or if you suspect something, say something, because you never know. And there's so many indicators of child abuse and child neglect that if you're concerned, you need to make the call.
And can you I'm sorry, I was just going to ask if you can remain anonymous if you call people who don't want to get involved, but you want to help a child. Okay.
Yeah, in fact, 99% of the calls we receive are anonymous tips.
Right. And Mr. Lohmar?
Sorry to interrupt. I might add too, when you think about child abuse, I think historically you look at the parent or the caregiver, and while that certainly fits the profile, it's not always just the parental figure. Usually the abuser knows the person that abuses them, but it could be an extended family member, could be a relative, could be a neighbor, could be somebody that's lives in the neighborhood, older brother, for example. So I think from a parental standpoint, the biggest thing that you can do is just know where your kids are, know who your kids are with, and just be engaged.
Yeah, really good advice. I guess my next question would be if I'm a person who's going to call in because I have a concern, or maybe I'm a parent who thinks maybe something is happening with my child that I'm, not sure about, or I'm concerned about. What's the process? Once I call and once police get involved, what's the process?
Well, the law enforcement standpoint, once we get a call to investigate, we start doing a workup. We're going to start, if it's something that's internet-based, we're going to start issuing subpoenas for the internet providers, and then we're going to do a workup on the residents to find out who lives there, if it is a home-based type abuse or neglect going on. We're going to do a workup, and then ultimately our detectives are going to go out and
when I say we, I mean the law enforcement agencies and our office collectively, that says that if you got a child witness, whether they're a victim or witness to some other sort of crime, their interview should take place with forensic interviewers at the child center. And the reason we do that is because the forensic interviewers are trained in interview techniques. They don't ask leading questions, and they can do a much more efficient job of actually getting to the truth without directing the child. If it's a parent that's questioning the child, we see this unfortunately all too often. The parent thinks they see something and they start to ask these questions, and then the questions can sort of lead the child's answer. And we want to try to minimize that. Also minimize the number of times the kids have to tell the story. This is probably the fewer times they have to relive it, the better. But after that, we get the case from law enforcement. We've got a very good partnership with our law enforcement agencies. There's a lot of open communication from really every stage of the investigation. And we will review that. And if we can determine, because in many of these cases, there's an ongoing case, that family dynamic doesn't.
Forensic interviews that Mr. Lohmar talked about, they're heart-wrenching, but again,
to deal with children in these cases.
Yes.
Parents are the first ones to talk to their children in most cases if there's any kind of concern like this. And you said that the questions that they wrong questions. For all of how we should approach that, is there human trafficking? What things should we look for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that's something that I think as law enforcement, we all need to become better equipped and better trained, prosecutors and police officers included. But some of the more obvious things that we can look for, if you see a huge age discrepancy between an adult and a young person that's with him or her, it's not just female victims. We have male victims as well. If you see young people out at a particular location at an unusual time of the day, late in the evening, early in the morning, just things that look out of place. A major area of human trafficking in our state is the truck stops up and down the interstates. What is a child doing at a truck stop? Chances are, especially late at night, it could be a situation where this person's being victimized. So it's just things that look out of place. Those are the real obvious signs to look for.
And Chief Frisz, what should we do if we think we are witnessing something like that? Should we approach that child? Most people don't have a hotline number in their back pocket. What should we do?
You could always dial 911. If you're in a rural area, star 55 for the highway patrol. But it really is about making that initial call to law enforcement just to get some resources rolling. We don't recommend you approach, but we'd rather you observe. Just about everybody has a cell phone. If you can take some pictures or some video of what you're witnessing in the event they leave before law enforcement arrives. So there's a lot of things you can do to help us initiate the investigation. With human trafficking, it's even more of a challenge, whether it's an adult or a juvenile being trafficked. A lot of times it's not necessarily the physical appearance, but it might be that look of fear on someone's face, or someone that's being controlled or with a very controlling person. They're not speaking for themselves. There's a lot of if you observe someone in a restaurant or a rest stop or something like that, and it just doesn't look right. It's not always, like I said, it's not always physical indicators. Sometimes there's some other indicators that might lead you to believe that there might be some human trafficking going on.
I know here at Fox 2, we have a number of stories that we do on a regular basis of parents leaving the child in the car unattended, or in a car seat because they're only going to run in for just a few minutes. To me, that seems very dangerous when we're having this discussion today. Talk about what parents can do and what family members can do to protect children from this kind of exploitation. And I'll start with you, Mr. Lohmar.
Okay. Sure. I think the best thing that parents and caregivers can do is just stay engaged, stay involved. And I know when you get to have teenagers, I have too, it's not always easy to stay involved and know everything that's going on. But just look for some signs. Look for signs of withdrawal from family or friends. Look for signs of injury. Look for signs that they're hanging out with a different crowd of people. Pay attention to whether they seem more isolated, things like that, depressed. Those could all be symptoms of somebody who is vulnerable, or either vulnerable to become a victim or already is a victim.
Right. And Chief, same question.
Well, especially for the real young kids, like the example you used of just running into the store for a few minutes, leaving your kids in the car unattended. This day and age, it's unacceptable. And we do get those calls on occasion to a child left alone in a car in a parking lot of a local store. So we will investigate that. We take it very seriously. So it's things like that, especially for your young kids, just don't let them out of your sight. Know who they're with. Be very cognizant of if you're leaving trusted care of a extended family member, make sure that you truly trust that extended family member. A lot of times we see these situations evolve from broken families, or a mother that's divorced and has a new boyfriend, or a stepfather. So there's just so many things you need to really protect your kids and be careful who they're around.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to remind everyone who's joining us today that we would love to hear from you and have your questions. And you can use the chat feature to submit those questions. We do have a few coming in, and we have some folks that are going through those and trying to get those up right now so that we can ask Mr. Lohmar and Chief your questions. I guess that I want to talk now, and Chief, you mentioned this. You mentioned a couple of times cybercrime and the cybercrime unit. Tell us about the MOICAC and the cybercrime unit in more detail, kind of what they do and how they help in these situations.
Well, Missouri ICAC is the Missouri Internet Crimes Against Children network, and it is a statewide task force. We're very fortunate. In St. Charles County, our cybercrime unit is really the hub for the Missouri ICAC. And so all the hotline calls come into here. What I can tell you is just a few quick numbers is they received over 5,100 hotline tips last year. About 250 of those were based in St. Charles County that we investigated. So you can see the Missouri Internet Crimes Against Children hotline does get used, and we get a lot of calls. And then if it's local based here in St. Charles County, then that's my cybercrime unit is the one that's going to investigate that and run with that investigation. In 2020, through those tips, we investigated 12 child molestations, 15 abuse and neglect cases, and 9 endangering the welfare of a child cases. Those are cases that we made. So it's a very active unit, and I say that the Missouri ICAC is they do a tremendous job. They do all the vast majority of forensic investigations into cell phones and computers when it comes to the human trafficking and doing the investigative work. And so we can get into these cell phones through the subpoenas and find out, our search warrants, and do that investigation and find out who's in contact with these children. But Missouri ICAC and the Cybercrime Unit is a great resource here.
I feel like we have gone over this information a lot in the news, just advising parents on being aware of who their children are online with, who they're interacting with social media. There's so much. I don't even know what TikTok is. I couldn't get on if I had to. But Mr. Lohmar, like you I have teenagers. And how do you, or what advice do you have for parents as far as the social media, all of the influences that our children have out there now that we really maybe don't know about and maybe don't control? And I'll start with you, Chief.
Well, there are certain ways you can get on first of all, if your child gets a computer or a cell phone, you got to have control of that. You got to be able to view the phone. There's filters you can put on there. There's restrictions you can put on there. But especially when it comes to chat and all these different social media outlets, it seems like a new one's popping up every day. You got to be aware of who they are communicating with via whatever network it may be on. That's where we get into human trafficking. Is they get contacted by somebody out of state. It starts off as what we call a grooming process by just some friendly chat back and forth, and then it evolves from there. And that's what parents need to stay engaged with. And after hours, child's going to bed. There's absolutely no reason for that cell phone or computer to be in the bedroom with them. Just take control of it, and let them know, lay down the guidelines and the rules of that mobile device when you give it to them. And otherwise, that's where you lose control.
Yeah. We do have a question that came in. This is a really good question. They're asking if you have seen an increase or decrease in human trafficking cases, or really maybe just all neglect cases or abuse cases since COVID hit last March. That's a year kids are more at home on their computers, on social media, out of the classroom. Have you seen an increase or decrease in human trafficking cases during this last year?
Well, I'm looking at the 2019 stats as opposed to the 2020. And fortunately, it's about the same, fortunately or unfortunately, but COVID doesn't seem to have spiked that up. But unfortunately, on the other end of that, it's pretty steady and consistent. That it does exist. It exists in our community.
All right. Sarah Bell, we appreciate you sending in that question. I want to hit a little bit more on the cyber bullying, not bullying, but the cyber abuse with you, Mr. Lohmar. Is there a different prosecution process, or is there a different process when it comes to physical neglect, abuse versus what you're getting online or on social media?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That's one way that technology has made our jobs a lot easier. If you've got a crime that's been committed through the use of some sort of technology, some sort of cloud-based device, whatever the case might be, it's very, very easy for our cybercrimes unit to go in there and pull out that information, and it's hard to refute it. If you're an individual who's caught doing that, how do you refute?
Yeah.
What comes right back to your name? So in that sense, it's much easier than your traditional child abuse case. I was thinking of one situation. I don't want to present this to scare anybody, but just to show how real these things happen and how quickly they happen. We had a case a couple years ago, St. Charles County. It was a 13-year-old girl, and she was just your typical average 7th, 8th grade girl. She got on an app and she began to communicate with somebody she thought was another teenager. They communicated for less than 24 hours, and this individual came over to pick her up. He was going to take her out to get ice cream. She got in the car. She realized this person was not exactly who she thought it was. Long story short, it turns out that this individual was from Kansas City, was affiliated with a gang that was known to be heavily involved in human trafficking. That little girl was just a few hours away from being victimized for who knows how long. So that's how easy those things can happen. And that's why again, I don't know if we're ever going to be able to find out exactly what our kids are doing online, what apps they're using. By the time we learn them, there's probably something else that's just come out. But I think it's just open, honest communication with your kids, and maybe in such a way that they know they're not going to be punished if they have a question or they bring it to your attention that they saw something they shouldn't have seen, or they were contacted by somebody they shouldn't contact. Again, just openness is probably the best thing we can suggest.
And what a great story. That's really scary, but it hits home for all of the parents and family members out there, how easy that sort of thing can happen when you would have no idea, just in your community, in your house. We do have another question that came in. I want to get down here. This one came in from Brianna Hartman. It says, what would you suggest for victimized families to help cope with waiting for potential charges during a pending investigation? So that's a good question. So they've gotten through the process. They've called law enforcement. Mr. Lohmar, now the case is in your office. They're just waiting for the process. What can they do to help cope with it? What can they do for their children? Are there any resources out there for families?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We have several community resources, depending on the situation. Crisis Nursery being one. Of course, mental health agencies, faith-based agencies, counseling. Counseling is a big deal. I think if you believe your child's been victimized and you're waiting to see what happens on our end of things, best thing you can do is get your child in to see a counselor so they can talk about it, because there are going to be things that they will only tell you much more down the road. In a lot of cases, they'll begin to develop the confidence to talk about it more. But it's a process, and so the sooner you can get engaged in that, the better. That is a challenge for sure. The faster we can move these cases along, the better. But obviously, you can't move too fast, so that you don't have enough evidence to prove your case. So it can certainly be a frustrating, vulnerable time for families.
Yeah, and that question was from Katie. And Katie, we appreciate you sending that in. Let's see, we've got another question coming in. With COVID, this is a subject that has been on our radar as well. Parents who have not sent their kids to school during COVID 1 year, but they're getting schooled at home. Okay, that's one thing. But this question says, it's from Amy, and she says, is a child not going to school for 2 years considered neglect? She's not asking if they're being homeschooled or they're in any kind of program. Sure. So I'm assuming that she means that they're not, and they're just not going to school.
Well, that's not an easy question to answer. There is a law that we call educational neglect, which falls in the same family tree as physical and emotional neglect. A lot of it depends, but basically the process here in St. Charles County is that the juvenile office will be notified if a child has excessive absences. They will begin a process of trying to re-engage the child and his or her family. A lot of times that solves it, but if it gets to a point where the absences continue and they become excessive, that parent can certainly be held accountable for educational neglect.
Okay. All right. Before we move on, I think human trafficking is one of those subject matters that frightens people to death, because you think, is it really that prevalent? Is there really that's so rare, and I'll never experience that, or my child will never experience that. Tell us how prevalent it is. How big of an issue is that in our area? Chief Frisz, I'll ask you that first.
Well, and I think that's kind of one of the, it's not real public, but it's very prevalent in our community, in the region and around the nation. The trends are all the same, whether it's in the form of prostitution. Usually there's a promoter behind that is controlling that person. We see that a lot, all the way down to the human trafficking of children. So we see it in both varieties. It is tragic. We see a lot in this area. We see a lot of adult human trafficking. We've very recently investigated a case where you can see this individual clearly being controlled by a male handler that she had. She wasn't in control of herself. So we do see these cases. It is more prevalent than I think the general public would realize.
And Mr. Lohmar, what are you seeing, and what types of programs are out there to combat this?
Yeah, so I would add, if you look at the national trends and the local trends, we know human trafficking is prevalent here in this area. The problem, as I said before, one of the problems is just us being trained in how we spot that and what we do about it. But the other thing, which is a very real challenge, is many of these victims, whether they're child victims or adult victims, they are coerced with threats of abuse, with their handler induces a drug addiction. They emotionally and psychologically abuse them to such an extent that they feel like they can't leave. And if they do, they're going to be in danger. So from that standpoint, these are tough cases for law enforcement to prove, because oftentimes you don't have a cooperating victim. Several cases we've had over the years, we have a unit that is locally devoted to human trafficking. And I've seen several occasions where it takes months and months for them to finally get the victim to cooperate. And so that's a huge challenge. But it's definitely here. The reason you don't see more prosecutions because of it is A, we're still learning how to spot it, and B, it's just very difficult to get cooperating witnesses to such an extent that you can push forward a case all the way through the system.
Well, again, that's why this kind of discussion and this kind of event is so important, and for us to hear from both of you so that we can also know how to identify and the process we should go for if we are concerned about what we're seeing. So we thank you again for giving us that insightful information. Before we move on to kind of more in-depth discussion about the investigation process, is there anything else that either of you would like to talk about, add, or anything that we didn't mention or I didn't ask about how child abuse and neglect correlates with human trafficking?
One thing I'll add, especially with the example Mr. Lohmar gave about the, I think I'm familiar with the case he talked about, the individuals out of Kansas City, and it's the Amber Alert feature on your telephone. If that's the same case, it was resolved because someone paid attention to their Amber Alert on the phone, recognized the description via the Amber Alert. So that's a feature that you have on your cell phone that we encourage you not to disable. I know it's a little loud at 3 o'clock in the morning, but it has saved lives. And so the Amber Alert's very important. Very
good point. Mr. Lohmar?
I would just echo that. Again, I think everybody's fear is that if you report something that you're wrong, or somehow you're going to get somebody in trouble. We have a process in place so that even if you make a good faith complaint that somebody might be victimized, your identity is protected to the extent that we can, and the investigators take over at that point and really can vet out the process. So again, to hesitate to contact the authorities if you think something's not quite right.
All right, thank you. So we're going to move on now and talk a little bit more in depth, and you've already mentioned it a couple of times about the actual investigation process. And Chief, you also mentioned that some numbers of cases that you've worked on last year and this year, but can we just reiterate a little bit about the child abuse and cybercrime reports that you investigate annually? What are we talking about? How many?
Well, for instance, last year, as I mentioned, the Missouri Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force received over 5,100 calls into the SUDA hotline. We have a detective that does nothing but delve those out to the various regions of the state. Of those complaints, 225 were cyber tips that were investigated by our unit here in St. Charles County. Our unit processed nearly 700 devices, whether they be computers or cell phones, in reference to child abuse, child neglect, or human trafficking. So those are forensic audits and investigations into electronic devices. And again, identified 36 child victims in those investigations just in our county.
All right. We have another question that is coming in right now. And Mr. Lohmar, I'm going to let you address this one. It says, could you discuss the role of the Family Care Registry in protecting the community from abusers, even when the prosecutor's office chooses not to pursue a criminal case?
Sure. I'm not familiar with all the intricacies of how the Family Care Registry works, but I know generally it's a program that's offered through the Department of Health and Senior Services Family Division. And what it does basically is provide background information so that, if a potential employer, babysitter, coach, something like that is being considered, you can go to this database and find out information. See, has this person been accused of abuse or neglect in the past? Does this person appear somehow on the law enforcement radar for something he or she should not have done? And that in a general overview, that's what the Family Care Registry can do.
All right, and we thank Susie for that question. One of the next questions that came in was just talking about the process of investigation. I feel like that we went through that pretty well. Is there anything, though, that you would like to add that maybe we didn't cover about just the process of a child abuse and neglect investigation? And like I said, I feel like that we did go through this, but if there's anything you'd like to add, I want to make sure we include it.
I think the most important thing is the investigation can't start until the call's made, whether it's via the tip line 911 or just somehow contacting local law enforcement. That we can't investigate until we know about it. But what I do want to emphasize is, again, these are priority cases. We treat everyone. The investigation is not going to be a detective pick it up in a week or so. It's going to be immediate. There's going to be some sort of response or investigation initiated.
All right.
Sandy, I might add also, especially when it comes to sexual abuse of a child, we see this often, that the victim that we're aware of is not the only victim that's out there. So we may get the case initially, but as we continue the investigation, and as law enforcement, a lot of times they'll send us the case, we review it, we charge it, they still investigate. They're still interviewing people, and many times we'll find several other victims by the same perpetrator. And so that's I should say that's an unfortunate yet common characteristic in child sexual abuse cases.
What is the average, I guess, charge, or maybe not charge, but sentence for someone who has been charged and is convicted of child abuse or neglect? And I'm talking about a sexual predator here.
Sure.
What's the average sentence for that?
It depends on the nature, of course, of the offense, but our default position here in St. Charles County is that you do go to prison, depending on the length of the time that the offenses took place. And we have many times where they've taken place over several years. Very few times is it just an isolated incident here or there. But the lengthier the period of perpetration, the lengthier the sentence typically. You're talking, some of these cases carry with them double-digit prison sentences. In many cases, up to life in prison. That doesn't happen often, but it certainly happens. But there are exceptions. Let's say you have a victim that, we've had this before, unfortunately, where the default position of this particular person's charge would be prison, but you've got a victim that, for whatever reason, let's say it's his or her father, her mother, her uncle, they don't want to testify anymore. And so you have to sometimes come off of that so you can hold this person accountable the best way that you can without traumatizing this victim and forcing them to go through a trial that they don't want to have anything to do with.
Right. And a very good point there. And I think that's what I was trying to get to, is that oftentimes it is jail time. So it's not a slap on the wrist and they're not going to be back in this person's life, because I'm sure that that's a huge concern. So I just kind of wanted to get to that. I think the other thing, Mr. Lohmar, is you gave us a really good example of a case of that 13-year-old girl that you just told us about not too long ago. Are there any other cases that either of you have been involved with that can really kind of hit home for our viewers today, that might help us understand what's going on and how we can help?
I'll start. One that probably will forever stand out to me, even long after I retire from this job. And several years ago, we had a case that received a lot of local media attention. Sandy, I'm sure when I explain this to you, you'll remember it. But two parents kept an autistic child basically in a cage. It was a crib with plywood, zip tied. So it was literally a cage with 4 walls and a ceiling. The child had been in there for several months. And for a variety of reasons, it didn't get reported to law enforcement quickly. But that one was a great example to me of how you have all kinds of different stakeholders involved. You had the children's division workers. You had paramedics who were involved in rescuing the child. You had, gosh, I remember interviewing the detective who initially worked the case. They see tough stuff every single day, but this was something that brought her to tears. But at the end of the day, with the teamwork effort and just the disgusting nature of how these parents chose to raise their child. We were able to get, after jury trial, they were found guilty. Both mom and dad were found guilty. They were given the maximum sentences. So it was gratifying in the sense that there was a lot of teamwork that went into this investigation, holding these parents accountable for what they did. The sad part is we'll never know the long-term effects that had on this particular child.
Right. And Chief Frisz, these are tough to talk about, but any specific instances that you can share with us?
Well, one common theme we see too often with regards to child abuse and especially sexual abuse is often it's correlated with alcohol and drug abuse for the parents. And, we see that a lot when there's a chronic abuse of narcotics or alcohol. And, a lot of times that'll be complemented with deplorable conditions the family's living in. The child's going to school filthy, dirty. We see this quite a bit, and certainly one of the major indicators of it. But that's one of the nexuses we always see with child abuse.
And just a few more questions here. And again, we'd like to invite anyone to submit questions via your chat feature. Chief Frisz, the St. Charles County Police Department does a lot. You guys are involved in the community. This event today also proves how much St. Charles County is involved with the community, wants to protect its citizens and especially its vulnerable young people. This question is just kind of a bullet point, if you will, or programs that you might want to share. What are you doing to keep our children safe in St. Charles County?
Well, I think just what we're doing today, it's about advocacy and education and partnership throughout the community. We have a lot of partners, Crisis Nursery, Bridgeway, Gateway Human Trafficking, our schools, our hospitals, our faith-based organizations. All those are great resources to help educate and bring awareness out, not only to the adults, but to the children too. They hear these things and they need to hear these things. As tough as it is, sometimes the message needs to be delivered a little bit differently. But it's all about the advocacy and making the awareness and the educational component of it to let people know that this is real in our community. And that's something this department's been dedicated to doing.
All right. And we talked a little bit about the organizations that your office works with, Mr. Lohmar. Are there any other organizations that you want to specifically mention?
Gosh, I'm afraid that if I started to list them,
the list would go on. It's like thanking people after the Emmys. Yeah. I understand.
But I will say, Crisis Nursery, they have been a valuable community resource, for lack of a better word. Real briefly, what their mission is if, as a parent, if a parent feels overwhelmed, ill-equipped, unable to properly care for a child, the nursery is there for the parent to use as a resource. The nursery will take care of that child on a limited basis, but at least until such a time that the parent is better equipped to care for a child. That's a major way to prevent future child abuse. The Child Center, we've mentioned that a few times. They're based out of Wentzville. They are a close partner of ours as well as the police departments. They are the forensic interviewers. They're the ones that really help us figure out what exactly happened to this child. So again, they're not so much on the prevention side as they are the investigative and prosecution side, but they also have lots and lots of preventative type programs as well, for lack of a better word. And I'm probably leaving somebody out. For those of you I left out, I'm sorry.
There's so many great community organizations, so we really do appreciate all of them and the work that they do. I have a tough question. We've got a question that's coming in, and it's kind of a double-parter, so you're going to have to excuse me as I just read it cold here for you. But it says here, could you speak to the importance of parent-guardian advocacy in the investigations? Most people don't realize how much of a difference an informed and engaged adult can make in helping pursue justice and teach healing for these kids. I mean, that's a really good point too. It goes from the police to the prosecuting attorney's office, including that whole time frame from when you get it, when you receive it, and the process it takes to get it done. So I guess what this viewer is asking is just maybe highlight the importance of having an adult by that child's side to advocate for them and to be there for moral support.
Well, it's having an adult, having a responsible adult. And by and large, that's what our community is. We grow great families out here in St. Charles County. But For those that have issues in their family, whether it's a broken family through divorce or single parent families, or drug abuse, alcohol abuse, those are all the things that we look for in a police department. So having a responsible adult truly caring for these kids, and where it's head gets reported to us, is large times it's through the daycares or the schools when the teachers start seeing the child maybe becoming quiet or reserved or depressed or maybe not clean. So that's an indicator of maybe there's not a responsible adult taking care of these the kids.
Sandy, I could sort of take the opposite approach to that question and tell you what happens if you don't have that sort of parental involvement and that active advocacy engagement. We've got several cases that we've charged, and I know Chief has experienced it in the pre-charging stage where the parent, they don't want to believe the child. Let's say it might be a step parent who's the accused, or some other relative. And that's a major impediment to not only to us investigating, but in a lot of cases to the child even being made available to testify and give us his or her version of events. So that's a worst case scenario. So, but the question brings up a good point, and it's hugely important to have an active, engaged parent, a parental figure in the process.
All right, very good. And we should also mention, as you talk about all of the great organizations and groups out there that help children, Youth in Need is another one that we should mention for teenagers, children that are a little bit older, but it's a great organization that's been around for a long time, so we want to mention them. I guess as we start to close things out, this is the tough one because we've talked a lot about what to do in these cases, the process, the investigation, the prosecution, the sentencing, all of that. But what about false accusations? Let's talk about that. What if someone makes a false accusation that turns out after the investigation is just simply not true? Can you speak to that for us? And I'll start with you, Chief.
Okay. Well, I have emphasized the importance of making that phone call, and certainly we're going to take it on its merit. If it, in our initial investigation, if we find absolutely no indication of what the report was, then we're going to look at the caller. But a lot of times it's anonymous, so there might not be any consequences because we want people to be able to stay anonymous and feel comfortable in reporting. So that's challenging. It's a legitimate question because it can be used as a weapon of revenge. But usually the investigation is going to reveal that pretty quick. But unfortunately, it's probably going to be an anonymous report.
Right. And Mr. Lohmar, the same question to you. What happens to that person? Are there charges that could follow if someone does make a false accusation against someone?
Yeah, there certainly are. And I would say this. I'd like to think that we spot these certainly more often than not, and almost always. These types of cases, they're so specialized in the way they're investigated and prosecuted. There's a very specific vetting process that each of these cases go through. And so at each stage in the game, somebody else, another set of eyes gets to look at the claim or the evidence presented. And so I feel like it's a pretty sound way of determining what the truth is. But, things happen. We've had occasions where somebody's made a false report. A child that's making a false report, that's a different scenario. That's not a criminal matter. That's more of a family matter. But if it's an adult, and especially somebody who's doing it vindictively, for example, there's a criminal charge that goes with that. And that would be a misdemeanor. Potentially somebody would look at some jail time or something like that.
All right, good to know. That kind of wraps up all of the questions that I had for you gentlemen today and the questions that came in for the program from our viewers. I'd like to just ask for closing remarks from each of you, just kind of some bullet points of some important takeaway messages from today's event. And Chief, I'm going to start with you on that.
Well, this is a great forum, and I think just being aware that this does exist in our community is it's a big part of it, that child abuse, child neglect, human trafficking, all these things go hand in hand. Unfortunately, it happens out here in St. Charles County. But it starts with see something, suspect something, say something. You got to make that notification to the tip line, to 911, get law enforcement involved so we can do the investigative process and eventually get in the hands of the prosecutor's office. So that's the first step. Problem is, a lot of times when we start these investigations, we're already behind because it's been going on. People are hesitant to call, and I understand that. But Generally, the abuse has been going on for quite a while at the time someone detects it and suspects it. So,
right. Mr. Lohmar, same question. Just any takeaway message that you would like to leave with our viewers today?
Sure. I think that the most important thing as a parent or caregiver is that you have, as best you can, an open relationship with your child, open communication. Let them know that they're able to bring anything to you without judgment, because that's really how we learn about our kids is asking those open-ended questions and just let them talk. In closing, I would say, as you referenced a couple times, Sandy, these are difficult cases, and probably these are our most difficult cases from an investigative standpoint to the prosecution standpoint. However, my team of attorneys, the detectives, the investigators, the forensic interviewers, the children's division workers, all of whom are involved at some step in each and every investigation, when you can hold an abuser accountable and you can see the child gets his or her voice back, there's not much else in this profession that gives you the sense of satisfaction as something like that does. And that's what keeps us coming back, doing it again over and over and trying to get better. So it's been great to be a part of a forum like this, so we can spread the word and get people talking about this and educate the community. And I just thank you for your time.
Thank you. And Chief Frisz, Mr. Lohmar, some fantastic information that you've shared today. We appreciate your time so much. And we thank all of our viewers out there for joining us for our first Lunch and Learn live event. I hope that you took away some great information. Remember, there are amazing resources out there that can help in these situations, and we encourage you to take advantage of those when necessary. Again, thank you for your time today.